Welcome, everybody. Our topic for today is the role of data in supporting recovery in K-12 U.S. public schools after COVID-19. Excited to have you join us for this discussion. I'm Robin Lake, and I direct the Center on Reinventing Public Education, or CRPE. And since the start of the pandemic, my colleagues and I have been trying to track school system response to the pandemic and tried to organize knowledge on the impact on students and families during the crisis. You know, now, what are we now? 16 months or so into the pandemic with some semblance of normalcy on the horizon, we all hope. It feels like a critical time to have this discussion about data for all of us to really start taking stock on the impact of kids to date. We know that some kids have had almost a year and a half of mostly remote learning. Most have experienced a great degree of social isolation, lack of special education services, the impact on kids who are non-native speakers and other special populations is concerning. And the early data are showing us we have good reason to be concerned. So the kids are not all right. We know that. They're owed a lot, and we know there's an urgent need to catch them up. But we also know, don't we, that they were not all right before. The inequalities have only been exposed and exacerbated, and the rigidities and the one-size-fits-all solutions that failed too many kids before have now affected kids across the country of all backgrounds. So we have urgent work ahead, timely conversation to talk about data. So we're going to explore questions of how policymakers and practitioners can use data from different types of assessments and educational activities to inform their decisions, to really become strategic in what they're thinking about, how they're going to approach this unprecedented challenge ahead of them, and what the research and measurement communities need to do their work to support practitioners and policymakers. So all of us need to come together around these kinds of conversations. So excited for this one. We'll frame much of the discussion today around equity, how to use data to promote equitable learning opportunities and outcomes. And I think, you know, the reason is obvious, but I will just stress that, again, when we look at the research so far, the average numbers really don't tell us very much. It's really about what individual kids have experienced, what different types of student groups have experienced, and what we do about them. So to inform these really critical questions, I couldn't ask for a more astute and expert panel of folks who really are the top experts in the country on assessment and measurement. We have researchers and practitioners here, so we're going to make some real progress in the short time that we have. We have Scott Marion, who's Executive Director, Center for Assessment, Laura Hamilton, Associate Vice President, Research Centers at Educational Testing Service, and her colleague Tanner Jackson, Senior Director of AI Research and Data Science, also at ETS, and then Maggie Paino, Director of Accountability at the Indiana Department of Education. Welcome, everybody. Let's get started with the conversation.
Thank you.
So, folks, you know, we're gonna talk about the ins and outs of measurement and assessment, but it seems to me that it's hard to have a useful discussion about the role of data and successful rebuilding and recovery and restitution without first talking about what we're trying to accomplish, right, and what we're trying to measure. So my first question for you to kick things off is, you know, as you think about the role of data, and we think about kind of taking a lens of looking maybe 5 years out, I want to ask you, how would each of you define success? How should we think about kind of a collective national or state-specific goal over the next 5 years to catch students up to where they were? Or should we use this moment to really be thinking differently? So why don't we start in the order of Maggie, Tanner, Laura, and Scott?
Sure. So in Indiana, we're really just starting to dig into our data analysis from this past year and what we really saw and experienced from an academic impact for our students. And it's forced us to take a step back and really consider what we have been doing, educational programming wise, and evaluating whether or not that is really truly an effective approach. And that is, for us, I think the way of looking at recovery and success is kind of reevaluating how we are providing services and instruction to our students, and ensuring that the education that we're providing is meeting the needs of all of our students, and that we are identifying where those inadequacies are on our end from a policy perspective, and making sure that those are addressed. So we're kind of measuring our success in how can we ensure that every individual student is getting the services that they need to move forward, and how can we ensure that we are driving that, because we know that at the state level, the work that we do, we're providing, essentially we're asking the students and the teachers and the schools to go to the moon within the next 5 years, but without the equipment and the resources to build that rocket ship, they're never going to make it. And our role and responsibility is to build that, to provide those resources to them, and to help guide and instruct them so that they know how to get to the moon. Or heck, build an IKEA dresser, maybe even. Yeah. That's probably harder than getting to the moon.
That's right.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Well, our job as researchers is to help you all get to the moon, I guess. So, Tanner.
Yeah, thank you. I like that example. So my perspective kind of comes from the opposite end of the spectrum from policy, and I focus more on implementation and the data around implementation and how we're going about getting that engagement, both from teachers and students at that lower level. And so for me, some of the things that I'd like to look at, especially in terms of metrics of success, is how are we increasing engagement for a lot of these different populations? How are we facilitating some of the decisions and that they're having to make in the classroom on the teacher side? But also, how are we doing a better job of getting the students involved and proactively seeking those learning opportunities that are going to help to drive them and build on their strengths? So my measures of success would be looking at the levels of student engagement increasing over time, in particular for groups that may have otherwise not been or who have been struggling during this COVID time. And so a lot of my work is looking at how do we make those opportunities that are meaningful for them, get them to actually engage so that they get the gains that we'd like for them and build off of that. So that's kind of where I would be coming from and looking out for 5 years out.
Yeah, thanks. And I relate to the IKEA building challenge. So I definitely have experienced that myself and could use some instruction in that area. I think that, just building on what Tanner just discussed regarding engagement, and I think to the Maggie's point regarding, getting our kids to the moon, we need to be looking not just at academic test scores, but at the whole child development, and thinking about how we meet not just their academic needs, but their social and emotional needs as well. When right before the pandemic hit, there had been kind of a movement and a growing body of research that, really demonstrated that students can't learn academically if their social and emotional needs aren't met. And so while we often will hear these things discussed as trade-offs, that we really need to get people back on track in reading and math, and we can deal with this SEL stuff later. The reality is they're all integrated. And as the Aspen National Seed Commission, which got a lot of press a couple of years ago, it was their National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, as they discussed, learning is inherently social and emotional. So I think that as we're, looking at what we need to do and evaluating our success in the coming years, we really need to be taking this whole child look. And we can build on work that had been done prior to the pandemic, but I think the pandemic has just kind of really ramped up the urgency of doing that and kind of accelerated this movement.
Yeah, so Robert, it's hard to follow these 4 brilliant or 3 brilliant people, well, 4 including you. So it's, but I do think that this is an important question, because just simply getting back to where we were, it's not so great. We've had 20 years of this sort of pretty standard top-down accountability approach, and I think we've had success with kids with disabilities. Probably we've had the most success under this top-down approach. They've been brought into regular curriculum and stuff like that. But other than that, we haven't seen really much movement that we could be proud of. And you know, I often think when people say, "Oh, we need to innovate for this next great thing," and you know, I'm old enough to think, you know, we were doing great stuff in the 1990s with performance assessments and engagement and things like that. So I think that we have to really think about what, particularly with both Maggie and Tanner were talking about in terms of connecting both sides of the house, right? In many state departments, Maggie can tell you that the accountability folks sit over here and the curriculum folks sit far away. And the reality is that they need to talk to each other. We just had we call it colloquium with, we design all these accountability systems. And it's like, we don't know that much about school improvement and school reform. So we brought in some of the top school reform, school improvement experts to teach us about how to really improve schools at scale and how to make up these kind of, you know, I'm glad you said 5 years, because it's not going to be a year. And so it's how do we come together and work together? And finally, I just couldn't help but thinking when Tanner was talking about engagement, you know, it's sad, one of the sad things this year, many sad things. Dick Elmore passed away. And, you know, he made it very clear that unless you're talking about student engagement, educator quality, and meaningful content all together, you're just rearranging the deck chairs on a Titanic. And so we need to keep that in mind as we move forward.
Thanks, Scott. It's such an important point, and I know from my discussions with policymakers, there's a real interest in using this moment to rethink accountability, kind of take stock of what didn't go well, but then, you know, kind of this really difficult tension that while inputs like engagement and things are critical factors to go into school improvement, we still kind of need to know what are the outcomes over time and how do we balance all that, inspire innovation without, you know, tamping it down. These are tricky questions, and Maggie, this is your job.
Right. Get to work.
Yeah. So Maggie, I'd love to know, loop back with you, kind of, you know, Indiana is really, in my view, ahead of the curve in terms of the types of data that they've been trying to collect over time. Kind of, you all have focused on career readiness indicators and a lot of really important data. So you're probably more data rich than many states, but, you know, as your state exam results are coming in and you're looking probably at other data points, I'd be curious to know kind of specifically, what are you learning from these results at this point about kind of the baseline of where kids are in Indiana, and what is that telling you about what you need to do to revamp your strategies as you talked about?
Yeah. So one of the things that we set out pretty early on to do is an academic impact study from the past year to look at not just necessarily drops in proficiency, but what those drops in proficiency actually mean. Looking deeper to say, you know, what was actually the impact that was experienced, and really focusing on 3 areas of, you know, who was impacted, what they were impacted in, and how much they were impacted in those areas. And so far, what we have found is that everyone was impacted, and there wasn't anyone who came out of this without some impact to their educational outcomes. We've also seen math being a major area that we are going to have to really dig in our supports and resources for our schools to help our students. And as far as how much impact, like I said, everyone was feeling the impact, and we saw it in a grave way for mathematics for all students. The other thing that we've kind of been starting to realize is, one, we've been able to identify those specific concerns that came from the impact of COVID-19. But then we've also, through this study, actually been able to have a deeper and better understanding of situations and scenarios that were existing prior to COVID-19 that we had no idea and went under the radar, and has forced us to realize that we need to be focusing on those areas. And
give us an example, Maggie.
Yeah, one in particular is our English learner population. One of the things that we found for our high school English learner students is that based on the data from this past year, they are essentially performing exactly how they did before COVID-19, while everyone else felt kind of a major impact, which indicates to us that they were performing in spite of everything else in the same way. And that whatever we're doing instructionally and support-wise for our English learners in that high school grade has not been working, regardless of COVID. So it's really forced us to see those things that we just didn't see before, which is, it's great to identify the areas of COVID and that were impacted directly by COVID, like our drops in math. And but it's been really enlightening and helpful to us to have this data source that shows us things that we have had go under the radar for years, just because the data really kind of indicated things were okay. But when we actually look at it through this lens and this context, we see that things were not okay. I think we intend to look at the data in more depth with kind of mode of instruction information as well. We're still kind of collecting that data, but to see how things varied between our students based on hybrid, fully virtual or fully in person. But the one thing that we really want to ensure with that data is that there isn't a causation analysis done, because in our view, there is no way that we can definitively state what caused these specific COVID impacts. COVID caused it. There are so many factors, social, emotional, mode of instruction, access to resources and technology. Those are all things that are compounding factors. So to point to one thing is really, in our view, a little, dare I say, irresponsible, because I don't think that we can really assign blame to one thing or over another in this instance. So while we're going to look at that, we want to steer clear of identifying or putting blame on one particular cause for all of the impact that we have. As far as, looking at the use of this data, we're really kind of alluding back to the first question, looking at this through the lens of, this is an opportunity to provide for an overhaul of our education system. We know that things that didn't work in the past, we now have kind of that spotlight from a policy perspective that we can kind of use this as kind of gasoline or fuel to drive those efforts, specifically in the areas of our achievement gaps that pre-existed COVID and continue to be maintained, that have never been addressed. And because of COVID, I guess this is one of our positives. We have that as an opportunity to say, well, we've got all this COVID money, we can drive that and to drive efforts to actually focus on these things, or policymakers just paying attention now too. So that's, a very general high level overview. I think one area that we do feel that there is a lack of information on for our state in particular, and I find this to be an unfortunate lack of information, is on the social and emotional well-being of our students over the past year. I hope that that's something that we can continue to build on, because I think that that's such an important factor in all of this work.
Yeah, great. it's a great bridge to Laura and Tanner's work at ETS, and I'd love to kind of, stay in this kind of gasoline leapfrog kind of idea. We have such a huge opportunity for states and districts to make investments in new measurement tools, and so, as we think about what could be, I'd love to know from our ETS friends, what are you most excited about, Laura? Whole child SEL tools are really interesting. Which ones are, in your view, the ones that folks should really be paying attention to right now? Do you have any cautions? Why don't we start there?
Yeah, so Maggie, what you just said about the need to monitor students' social and emotional well-being is, it's consistent with what we've heard from other data. One of the points I wanted to make is, as a researcher, I'm very aware that we don't always, as researchers, do the work that's necessary to inform policy and practice. But what I saw right after the pandemic hit and schools closed was researchers across the country really coming together. And Robin, the evidence project at CRPE was a big, I think, impetus for this, but really coming together to say, we need to track what's happening and understand the perspectives of different stakeholder groups across different contexts, so that we can, inform decisions going forward. And I think that that generated a lot of data that turned out to be very useful. One of the things that came out as a consistent theme across all types of schools at all levels, from teachers, principals, parents, and students themselves, was the significant impacts of the pandemic on social and emotional well-being, as well as the challenges that students were facing in those areas before the pandemic even hit. And one of the teacher surveys I was involved in when I was at RAND last year was, found teachers really wanting guidance on how to monitor their students' social and emotional well-being, especially remotely. It becomes much harder to do that when you're not in a classroom and interacting in person every day. So, Robin, to your question, there are a lot of measures out there. I think we at ETS have been, both contributing to that and also trying to help the field think about the advantages and limitations of different approaches to measuring, I'll call it SEL, social and emotional learning, and the risks that it raises. So, I think one of the things we saw during the pandemic was teachers coming up with their own methods to do this for the purposes of informing their day-to-day decisions. So, one-on-one check-ins with their students, exit tickets to, short little set of questions that you might ask students at the end of a class so that you're just getting that input. So there's some informal ways that can really be helpful for, I think, just getting teachers, making them aware of what their students need and figuring out how to support that. When you start to look at a broader, kind of from a broader perspective and trying to understand, so where are the gaps in access to social and emotional supports across different kinds of schools? Where do we really need to invest our resources? That's where it gets harder to find, measures that are, comparable, that have validity evidence to support making those kinds of inferences about student social and emotional learning. There are some places that are doing really interesting work using survey data. So the University of Chicago Consortium and the Chicago Public Schools have some good approaches, the core districts in California. But those surveys really measure a limited range of the kinds of skills and competencies that we care about. So this is an area where I think there's a lot of need for investment and a lot of need for caution. There's written about this elsewhere, but there's a risk of labeling students in ways that aren't helpful. There are concerns, legitimate concerns about whether these kinds of measures are socioculturally appropriate for all student groups. And not a lot of good work yet, although it's happening, on how to make them, appropriate for all different groups. And there are risks that teachers will be And they already are. If you talk to teachers, put in the position of having to be not just teachers, but mental health healthcare providers, and trying to address needs that are identified for which they haven't yet been trained. So if you're going to measure this stuff, you also need to have the supports to help teachers and students.
Use the power wisely.
Yeah.
Tanner, the opportunity to learn data are super interesting, and kind of the what you prefaced in your comments is being able to look at classroom-based activities and connect them to learning outcomes. Tell us more about the promise there and what you think folks should know.
Yeah, sure. And so this builds off a lot of what Laura was just talking about in terms of some of the things that we are looking at is a more holistic view of our learners, and then how to bring some of that information together to inform a lot of teacher decisions, where sometimes that data is in separate places. It might be coming from different sources. How do we help to kind of bring that together so that they can make more informed decisions, but also those decisions that may be more contextually bound for the circumstances of given students. So a lot of our work really focuses around equity, and how do we help to promote more of these opportunities to learn and make them more equitable, using some of the data, using some of the aspects of AI that we're working on, not only in terms of representing them in our initial designs, but also looking at them after the fact to kind of see, like, are we having those kinds of expected outcomes, and how do we help to facilitate these decisions? So a lot of the data that we're using is how do we pull multiple streams of data together instead of using a single source to help try to move things forward. And so we're doing that through a lot of our research work, looking at what are the factors that come into some of these decisions, which may be as simple as picking the next activity, or assigning groups, or larger curriculum activities in terms of which modules to have to hit next. So looking at a lot of different grain sizes and how that impacts student engagement and performance outcomes, but at a holistic level in terms of what are the factors that are really going to drive that for different subgroups. And so that's a lot of our focus, is how to make these opportunities to learn equitable, and really try to close a lot of these gaps or leapfrog over where we were before by promoting this engagement that gets down to the individual student level and how they're going to be moving that forward.
It's so exciting. I mean, as a researcher who for years has been confounded by kind of the black box problem, what explains, what explains the outcomes? And it has been so onerous for researchers to try to figure that out. So using technology to get to the grain size is really, really cool.
Could I add something here, Robin?
Yeah.
So just tying a lot of this together, what we're hearing now, whether it's for SEL or opportunity to learn, which we've been working on incessantly, the kind of stuff that Maggie's talking about, how do they use these data to actually improve learning? I think we've been beating this drum for 20 odd years, that a single assessment, whether it's an assessment of SEL that maybe is designed to have some comparability, is likely not going to be that useful at the individual kid level. Similar to the state assessment might give us a broad picture, but it's not at the right grain size, not tied close enough to curriculum to make a difference. And similarly with OTL, there's things I need to know OTL wise at a kid teacher level. And there's other things for this year. The kids have devices that are connected to the internet. That's big picture OTL. That's very different. So we have to stop thinking that the single test or the single survey is going to solve our problems. And we have to be smart about systems. And we're making them more complex because it's not just academic knowledge, it's social emotional stuff as well. But that's a key thing that we, if we drive something home, is we have to adopt much more of a systems perspective.
Yeah, Scott, can you say just a little bit more on, the reality? You're advising a lot of states right now and districts and folks, and they're facing, a really difficult reality and opportunity, maybe. Mm-hmm. State tests are going to be a very limited use because of so many administration factors, et cetera. So what do you, given that reality, given the need to get to a real grain size very fast to be able to problem solve, what's your advice to folks for this next fall and maybe even the summer?
Yeah, so Maggie hinted at it already, and it's this notion of, she didn't say it exactly this way, but it's description before inference, right? And inference before evaluation, but let's focus on description. So who was even there? Not who tested, who was even there? And because you look at that, you say, oh, we had 90% participation, but we only had 90% of the kids from before. So now we're down, considerably lower. And so we're actually pushing folks. I don't know how many will do this, but I've been yelling it from the rooftops that don't give the reporters the achievement data and the participation and enrollment data at the same time. Make them have to eat their vegetables first and give them the enrollment and participation data first 2 weeks before, and let them understand the context before you give them the achievement data. So we're urging folks to look at this very descriptively. And then, folks like us who live in the world of statistics and things like that, we make a living on variability, right? Well, variability has never been more important this year than ever before, because people say, there's a state that just released it. Robin Lake was quoted in this article, that released, they had 86% participation rate on average. The average is fine, but I guarantee you in that state, they had districts at 20% and they had districts at 99%. And so, whereas in the past, if we had 95% participation in a state, it might have ranged from 90 to 99 or 90 to 100. And so we have to pay so much more attention to variability now than we ever did before. So we're urging states to focus on description, focus on really understanding variability, and to do everything they can do to stay away from attribution. And then use these data carefully, along with other data that you might be collecting, but don't pretend that it's going to guide instruction for next year. What I'm really curious about is, if we have time, maybe we'll get to this, but will states and districts redirect funding away from the formula-driven funding for these ESSER funds, right? It's going to be apportioned by population or by Title I status. Will I learn enough from these state assessments to say, oh, wow, I need to give Robin's district twice as much money as I was planning? I think it's going to be a hard decision for states to make. And if they tested, and they tested in person. So I could rant on, but I won't.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's the question on everybody's mind, is how to use the opportunity of this, unprecedented degree of funding to really make investments that will lead to durable change, right? And I'd love to, we don't have very much time left, but if we could do a quick go around for anybody who wants to jump in, you don't all have to, but if you had a, magic wand, or, you could provide advice that folks would act on in terms of, where to invest some measurement data, even accountability resources, what would you say? What would you recommend?
Well, there's so many, and we talked about the sort of whole child issue, but one thing I wanted to point out is the need to pay attention not just to the students, but also the adults who are supporting them. Yeah. We know from some of the great data that's been collected, as well as anyone who's talked to a teacher in the last year and a half, this event has been enormously stressful for teachers who were already in a very stressful job. Mm-hmm. Similarly, school and district leaders and other staff at the school and district level have been facing just so many challenges, pulling them in a million different directions, and so attending to their well-being is going to be really important for enabling them to provide the supports to the students that the students will need. So as we're thinking about what to monitor, this is going to be something that's really crucial to monitor. And if we don't do it, we are going to see, massive turnover. We're going to see, mental health challenges coming up with our adult population, and none of that is going to be helpful for the students who we're really trying to support.
Indeed.
I'll give you a non-assessment answer on spending this money. What I would say is, I would tell people, I gave this advice yesterday, buy the highest quality curriculum you can, spend as much money as it takes to get your teachers up to speed and to really learn how to use that curriculum, embed high quality assessments in that curriculum, and then invest in high impact tutoring, both training and the resources to do it. That's 4 things to focus on. And don't buy products where they just change the label and says now ESSA approved, like we saw with Common Core, right? All of a sudden it's magical, right? Yeah.
Maggie, any advice for your peers?
Yeah, I know a couple of the things that we're considering and looking at as part of kind of a general statewide data modernization effort is to be able to build out our systems that are to make sure they're a bit more universal, and that schools can be able to then pull directly from that different reports that they don't have to work to compile on their end. All the work is done for them to save them that time. I think one of the things that we continue to see is just everyone is stretched very thin at the local level. And as much as we can provide that assistance, we want to be able to do that because we collect a lot of data. And we should be showing them that we are collecting that for a reason. And along with that, I think a big thing that we need to invest in alongside that is just data literacy. It's one thing to have the data available, and it's another great thing to have these reports get generated. But if you don't know what to do with that information, you'll never see any kind of local changes with your student population and the instructional methods. And that's always been an uphill climb for us, is just getting folks to understand what they're looking at. Even at a high level policymaker level, we'll share data and they'll go, oh, that's nice. So what's next, and not even take the time to digest it. And non-data related thing that we're looking at is Indiana is a very strong school choice state. And we know that we're going to continue to have virtual programming and virtual school options moving forward. So we feel that the onus is on us to ensure that we are providing high quality virtual learning and virtual programming. So we want to invest in the development of those and provide resources to local school corporations that do have a need in their community for virtual learning to ensure that what they are providing is actually effective.
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of echo, I think these are all fantastic contributions, and I think if we actually accomplish all of these, that would be great. I would like to echo specifically what Maggie was just talking about. I think it's important for us to, invest in some of that infrastructure, or especially around technology for the integration of data. If we're collecting all of this, we need to have ways that we can actually combine it, because a lot of times data gets stored in various places. It's not easy to actually reconcile how to make a bigger picture out of the same student. So I think finding ways of being able to handle that and use it appropriately with the data literacy piece is really important. And then also, we saw a lot of inequitable access to technology during when this happened. And so investing in some of the technological resources just to make sure that the students, there's equitable access. I know that was a big problem. And that's going to continue to happen for the foreseeable future unless we invest in that as well. But I think that aligns with some of the virtual schooling that you're also talking about, which is a very real possibility in the future.
Thank you all so much. It's just amazing to have your expertise to guide us through these really tricky questions. We could have talked for hours and hours about them, but I think, I've certainly learned a lot. And, I guess I'm heartened that there does seem to be so much agreement about the general direction we need to go and the need for tracking over the next several years, maybe more, about, whether kids are being paid back what they were owed, and whether we can figure this out for the next generation of kids and make sure they have the schools that they deserve. So, again, just thank you all so much. It's exciting to think about the potential. And for Maggie and those of you who've been close to the field, keep rested, stay strong. You've got a lot of work ahead.
Yeah, every state needs a Maggie.
Thank you.
Thank you.